In Vietnam, I experienced one day a situation where a OH-6 helicopter, a Cayuse, was making a gun run in the dive. The Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, would shoot 50 caliber incendiary round, which would enter the bottom left quadrant of the aircraft, go into the fuel tank, set the fuel tank on fire. The fuel would spill out of the fuel tank and then curve along the bottom of the aircraft. And the other pilots described it as looking like one of those World War II movies where the German fighter is going in to a crash. The airplane was in a dive. The pilot steepened the dive, blew the fire out, pulled it out, flew the aircraft back into the maintenance area, and the whole bottom of the aircraft was burned away. All the sheet metal was gone. There was nothing there but the struts and the self-sealing tanks, which are rubber. So, boy, there was a lot of head scratching on that one. There's about 5,000 rivets down there, and we were trying to figure out how we would ever be able to fix that. And we eventually just boxed her up and shipped it back to the States. But that was a really good example of the phenomenon of the OH-6 helicopter and all that came as in the background to result in that outcome, that very favorable outcome. Now, when the Korean War ended, the Army started analyzing what it had done well and what it had done not so well during the Korean War. And what they sort of figured out is that when helicopter crashes occurred, there were fires in about 10% of the crashes, but those 10% accounted for about 80% of the deaths. So there was a lot of head scratching going on there, figuring out, well, what can we do to reduce the fire loads on crashing airplanes? Now that's a big, tall order because sometimes these crashing airplanes are pretty dramatic and there's stuff going every which way, and how do you minimize all that? So the Army went to NASA Langley down in Hampton, Virginia, and asked them to work on the problem, and they did. So in order to understand better how the fires occurred, what they did is they built a device. It was huge. It was 240 foot tall. It was 400 feet long. It was 265 feet across at the bottom. And it was a mechanism that they could suspend a helicopter from a cable, release the helicopter. It would swing down like a pendulum, crash into the ground, massive fuel spillage, camera shooting 10,000 frames a second, and we're able to see what is going on inside of these dramatic fires where there's massive vaporization of the fuel. Pretty wild device. They would eventually use that device to start figuring out what was going on in these helicopter fires. And the result would be a series of engineering changes to the helicopters to help minimize the fire occurring. And we want to talk about one of the kind of tangential things that they worked on. So what they were working on is that oftentimes people in these fires would be burned. And so you had these 2,000 degree temperatures at the skin level, and things like nylon and such would actually melt into the skin. So this is very bad stuff. So they went to a guy named Fred Sweeney at DuPont, and they asked him if he could design a cloth that could tolerate 2,000 degrees. It didn't have to do it for very long, just for 10,000ths of a second or so, maybe 2 or 3 of those, but basically very high temperatures for very short periods of time. And the guys at DuPont, in fact, were successful in doing that. The net result is something that we call Nomex. It's a trade name for the DuPont has. And it looks a lot like rayon or nylon or one of those artificial cloths, but it will tolerate 2,000 degrees. And so basically they've saved thousands of lives because all this combat operation stuff that happened in Vietnam, there just weren't any fires. The pilots felt comfortable that if there was an accident, that they could get out of there, that they could get home alive. Now that would translate into a lot of gear used by firemen. It would translate into gears used by race car drivers. It would translate into some gear used by hot air balloonists, where the bottom panels on a hot air balloon are made out of Nomex. So true innovative, true forward thinking. Boy, I wish I had thought of this kind of idea.